Again, can you tell a difference? Can you tell a difference? Difference? Does that seem to be any different? Okay. Testing a different time. Any different? A little better? Does that seem to be better? As we begin our study this morning, you can be opening your Bibles to the book of Proverbs. We'll be looking at several passages from the book of Proverbs. And again, I'll emphasize for the benefit of our visitors that this is not a narrative type study. This is a topical type study. We'll be looking at different passages and how they relate to the idea of honesty. We've picked up on several different ones, and the theme of the book itself is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But within that, the fear of the Lord provokes different behaviors, one of which is fear of the Lord provokes honesty, provokes a wise man to be honest. And with that will be certain behaviors that we'll be studying as we go through our lesson this morning. So, Jared, can you turn the projector on there? As we begin our study, the title of the lesson is Honesty is the Best Policy, and that seems to be rather understated. Generally, good moral people recognize that being honest is an expected behavior. It's one of which is respected by people and peers. It is one of which is beneficial in business. It's one of which is beneficial in the family relationship. If we're honest with one another about our feelings, you're not constantly tiptoeing around certain aspects of the family. So those are all things that it relates to, but it's always beneficial to begin a study of a word study or a topical study, at least defining the term. So if we look at the idea of honesty, the first part of that word should look familiar. Honesty begins with honor. Being honorable and driving respect. So honorable and held in respect. That will not lie, cheat or steal, truthful, trustworthy, showing fairness and sincerity, free from deceit. And if we embody the three of those lines together, that generally gives us the idea of what we expect when someone is honest with us and the outcome associated with that. Honesty is manifested in several ways. Honesty, in spite of an apparent easy way out, honesty demands truth. When we teach our children to tell the truth, they may feel like as a youngster, as a toddler, it's easier to hide that I stuffed the clothes behind my bed, or that I hid the food in the pantry, or that as a teen I stuffed my lunchbox somewhere else until it got moldy, and just don't tell you about it. And those are all things that, in spite of an apparent easy way out of hiding it, it's just been easier to tell the truth. Honesty requires us to correct an erroneous perception. So, if we're being honest with ourselves and someone else is looking at us and perceiving us a certain way, do we not have an obligation to correct them on that perception? To leave them with a false perception is dishonest, is it not? Let's say in the workplace that someone comes up and compliments us for having done a good job on this task. What if we didn't have anything to do with it? Is it honest to accept that compliment, or to push that credit to the person that was responsible for it? Those are examples in how honesty is manifested, and in common everyday life. So honesty will guide and deliver. Proverbs begins in 11:3-5. The integrity of the upright guides them. And here, integrity in the English Standard Version is in the word honesty. And the integrity of the upright guides them. But the crookedness of the treacherous destroys them. The righteousness of the blameless keeps his way straight. But the wicked fails by his own wickedness. If you look at the New Living Translation, it's a bit easier, and it ties to the idea of honesty. Honesty guides good people. Dishonesty destroys treacherous people. Kind of boils it down into a nutshell. It fits with the same idea we've talked about before, about the fool and letting someone thinketh he stand, take heed lest he fall. It's the contrast between good and negative. We talked about the idea that parables are structured in different ways. Again, here is one that is a contrast. Good people, good things come. Wickedness causes treacherous or destruction, as opposed to a parallel type parable. In Acts 5, if we look at the idea of Ananias and Sapphira, were Ananias and Sapphira honest? Does anybody remember the story? Okay. The story of Ananias and Sapphira is that they had a piece of property, they sold it, and they came and laid the money at the apostles' feet to be able to help minister to the needs of the saints in the area. And that was all good and well, but what was the problem? Well, they lied. They didn't lay it all there, but were they required to lay it all there? No. But we go back to the idea earlier, they left a false perception, did they not? And we talked about in our earlier definition that, one of the applications is that if we leave a false impression, we must correct it. Well, when Ananias came in, Peter confronted him about having left that false impression, and he basically said, the men are at the door to take you away, and carried him out. By contrast, when Sapphira comes in, Peter asks her point blank, did you lay all of the money at our feet? Now there's a little bit of difference between the two. She had an opportunity to fess up, and she didn't do it. Peter was giving her an out at that point. Tell the truth. Just like when a parent confronts a child and the parent, knowing full well what the answer is, wants them to tell the truth rather than having to dig the way through it. What did Sapphira end up doing? She stayed with the falsehood. She left the false impression in place and the false perception in place, and as a result, she paid for it with her life. Honesty is a blessing passed down. In Proverbs 13:22, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for righteousness. In Proverbs 20:7, the righteous who walks in his integrity, blessed are his children after him. Proverbs 10:7, we have happy memories of the godly, but the name of the wicked person rots away. What do we know about King David? He's a man after God's own heart. And when I asked that question, most likely that was the answer that popped to most people's mind, because that's one of the things that's elevated from a remembrance standpoint about David, is that he was a man after God's own heart. That was his reputation. Now, as we look at this and the application of this, I'll run into people who were peers with my parents or had association with my parents, and they'll make comments. Obviously, comments there that are very encouraging, because in their eyes, my parents had a very good reputation and touched many people's lives. But, that's passed down. It's a legacy type thing. As I work with my children, hope to be able to instill a level of the same type of behavior where they are proud to have had a parent that cared for them and helped others and was spiritually faithful. Well, that's the type idea here about being honesty. A good man leaves an inheritance. Ahab. What do we know about Ahab? He was wicked to the core. He had a spouse that was wicked to his core. And the most notable story, if you asked anyone's story about Ahab, what probably pops to your mind as a story about him? Was it a good story? No. The story of Naboth's vineyard is just heartrending, what he did. So, totally dishonest in his behavior, totally dishonest in his wife's behavior, and as a result of that, that's what he's remembered by, as a contrast to what David is remembered by. Dishonesty is common in many environments. And we look at some of the environments that it's common in, it gives us an idea of where it comes to play. In the Bible, it talks about business with respect to false weights. In Proverbs 11:1, a false balance is an abomination of the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. If you're using a false weight, what are you actually doing when you measure out the goods that someone is buying? A false standard. We talked about false standards in our last study, but effectively you're stealing from them, aren't you? So not only are you being dishonest in your behavior, you're committing the sin of stealing. Proverbs 16:11. It is an abomination to kings to do evil, for the throne is established by righteousness. And this is an idea here where the kings themselves are taking away more than they're just do. Proverbs 20:10. Unequal weights and unequal measures are both like an abomination to the Lord. Same idea here, the matter of false weights and deception. Business and usury. We talk about lending and taking interest. Well, this is not necessarily my parents loaning me money to buy a house and charging me a going rate for interest. This is me going across town and finding a loan shark that's going to charge me 20% interest per day. There's a difference in that. One is an investment type arrangement, and one is taking advantage of another person's situation. Proverbs 29:8. Income from charging high interest rates will end up in the pocket of someone who is kind to the poor. This is the New Living Translation. Others are a little not as easy to pick that out of. But that particular passage is saying, you may do this. You may take advantage of someone. But in the end, where's that money going to end up? You're not going to take it to the grave with you. It's going to end up in somebody else's hands. We talk about something doesn't pay. A dishonorable act doesn't pay. It always comes back and visited back on the person that committed the evil. Matthew 21:12 through 13. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and brought in the temple, And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." What do you think was going on in that activity that so incensed Jesus? I think there's at least two different things that we could point out. So their first thing that they've done is they've perverted the spiritual and religious nature of the temple with a business activity. Okay? Now, and I agree with that. I think that's the first and foremost. The second thing there is that there were activities that were required for people that were traveling in for them to be able to obtain a suitable sacrifice. They did have to change money to be able to get their suitable sacrifice. So when I back up to the rest of this verse, a den of robbers implies that there's something else that's going on in that activity that was less favorable. So what can we surmise from that? If it's a den of robbers, somebody who's stealing, more than likely there was a case of not being fair, or taking advantage in the changing of money and not exchanging the weights properly, or using false measures to be able to do it. It's all of those type things together. I think the spiritual side of it's the first and foremost, and I think the second thing that he was incensed by is the evil that was going on in the hands of the money changers. So we see here the idea of usury and the exchanging of money. If we look at business, getting rich quick, so to speak. When you get rich quick, are you really taking advantage of somebody? Most of the time. Generally, if you're taking fair wages, it's not an instance where you're going to be taking advantage of a situation. In Proverbs 28:20 and 22, a faithful man will abound with blessings, but whoever hastens to be rich will not go unpunished. A stingy man hastens after wealth and does not know that poverty will come upon him. This idea here is implying that an individual who focuses upon hastening to garner their wealth and hold on to it is contrary to the ideas that are presented in the Bible. And we have later on in the New Testament an example of comparison of the individual who had great riches but did not share them. And the outcome did not go so well. Business, taking advantage of the poor. Proverbs 22:16 through 22. Whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth or gives to the rich will only come to poverty. Do not rob the poor because he is poor, or crush the afflicted at the gate, for the Lord will plead their case and rob of life those who rob them. There are two main points that this passage plays on. Now, the first one has to do with our relationship with the poor, or the relationship of an individual with the poor. It says here, one that oppresses the poor and takes from them. The second thing it mentions is giving to the rich, and that seems out of place in this passage. So as we think through, oftentimes when money is given to the rich and the influential, why is it given to them? A bribe, trying to gain favor, and that in and of itself takes away from the sense of, quote, fair play. It is not uncommon in certain regions of the world. If you want to get a construction project done, you've got to grease the skids on everything that you do. The United States has laws in place to be able to try to prevent those types of activity, and legally, and if you're in federal procurement or something, you can't participate in that. You lose your federal contracts and so on. But there's two ideas here presented. One is that you're going to oppress the poor and take from the poor, and the second is that you're going to push money to the rich to try and gain influence. Both are condemned in this passage. Now, why is it that the latter of buying influence, in this case, takes advantage of the poor? Let's say in the case of business, there are two equally capable businesses that are going after a contract. Maybe one that's actually even better than the other one. But yet one buys influence to try and sway the decision on the contract. Is it fair competition? No, it's not a fair competition. And in the case of that, you're stealing from the individual that actually may be better qualified to do the work than you were yourself. Proverbs 20:17. Bread gained by deceit is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth is full of gravel. That's a really interesting analogy. I think I don't really want to chew on gravel. But the point there is not that the person, physically turns to gravel, but, no sinner is ultimately going to receive his reward. Bread gained through a deceit is sweet to a man. It's going to seem great at the beginning. Well, I managed to win this. I managed to do this. But ultimately, if it's found out, it's going to be extremely painful. Dishonesty is common in Proverbs 12 and 22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. And I think the header on this has gone away. Let me look back and see if I can find that. This is the idea of speech. Sorry. Dishonesty is common in speech. So you can see from Proverbs 12 and 22, lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully are his delight. How can we be dishonest in our speech? Obviously lying. How many ways can we communicate? We can communicate verbally. We can communicate through body language. We can communicate through a number of other areas if we group those communication categories under speech. A lot of different areas there where an individual can convey a behavior through their actions that is inconsistent with their beliefs, or convey a behavior that is inconsistent with what they really want to provide as the message, or completely convey a message that's totally inconsistent with their original intent. There's a lot of different ways that speech can apply to this. Proverbs 10 and 18, one who conceals hatred has lying lips, and whoever utters slander is a fool. I just love him. That's an example of concealing hate. My words are opposite of what my actual intent is. My words said I loved him, but my body language and tone totally convey my discontent and hatred for the individual. That's that second verse is, hatred has lying lips. Is that kind of an idea. We may not love somebody, and this is odd for Christians. But let's say it's an individual who really has contempt for someone because of some activity that's occurred. In how they interact with everyone else around them, they very, very well portray that they are just as happy as they can be with that individual to keep other people from seeing their true nature. That's the message behind this. If we, as brothers and sisters, have a problem with another brother, and we essentially keep that all bottled up inside, and all outside appearances are that everything's fine, do we fit this passage? I think we'd have to say that we probably did. It goes back to the idea of leaving a false perception. Proverbs 23, 6 through 8. Do not eat the bread of a man who is stingy. Do not desire his delicacies, for he is like one who is inwardly calculating. Eat and drink, he says to you, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit out the morsels that you have eaten and waste your pleasant words. It's a long phrase here, but it's, the idea being conveyed is that you know, I am participating in this. This individual is offering this to me under some pretense. Whether it be he's telling you, eat and drink, I'm glad for you to have this, when in reality, he would rather you not eat at his table. But because of what other people may be observing, he feels like he has to. That's a perception again, a false perception that's being conveyed by the stingy man. By his nature, he doesn't want to give anything up. But when he does offer it, is it sincere? Or is it driven by, I need to hold up some other type of perception? Speech continued. A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness breathes out lies. We go into court to testify in a case. What do we want as a witness? An honest one. We want one that'll tell the truth. What's the first thing they're going to ask you if you get on the stand as a witness? Do you tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth? That's the first thing that's going to come out of their mouths, is asking you that, and ask you to either affirm it or swear to it. Proverbs 14:25, a truthful witness saves lives, but one who breathes out lies is deceitful. Well, deceit and lying is the same thing, but again, here's contrast. Truthful witness saves lives. That individual, takes care of things, takes care of them the right way by telling the truth. There could be situations where a truthful witness, it's painful for them in some way to have to tell the truth. Let's say that I have made a mistake let's say I'm a design engineer. Let's say I make a mistake in the design that ends up hurting someone, but only I'm the one that knows what that mistake is. Do I have an obligation to reveal that? I do. I'm leaving that false precept there. Now, in that case, I'm being a truthful witness. But I'd really benefit if I didn't tell the truth or just left it unsaid, because only I know. Think through that one. Stealing. Ephesians 6:8, let him who stole steal no more. The concept of being honest in our behavior, it relates to stealing and lying. The thief who finds no opportunity to steal thinks himself an honest man. Now this is an interesting one. Granted, this is not biblical in nature, but from a religious world standpoint, it's an interesting thought. A thief who's presented with no opportunity to steal anything. He's going about his day-to-day life. Okay, well, I'd probably like to steal that, but there's too many people watching, so I don't have an opportunity. He thinks he's being honest because he hasn't stolen anything that day. Is he actually being honest if we examine his perception that he conveys? No, because his heart's desire was to what? To steal it. Okay? Interesting thought process there on that one. Fruits of dishonesty. The heading on this from the fruits of dishonesty is a just reward. Sorry for the PowerPoint issue here. Galatians 6:7, whatever a man sows, that will he also reap. And we've already indicated here that there ultimately will be punishment for the sinner, for the individual that's taking advantage of another, or the individual that's leading a dishonest life. Whatever a man sows, that he'll reap. Oftentimes, if you participate in dishonesty, the people that you're associating with are most likely to be what? Dishonest. And as a result, you're going to end up reaping what you sow. Stealing. Ephesians 6:8, let him steal. And this looks like it may actually be a repeat. Sorry. I doubled up on my slides. Honesty is the best policy. want to look at it from a current world standpoint of several proverbs that fit and apply to this that are going to be, some of them going to be very common to us. We've heard them before. Honesty is the best policy. It's attributed to Benjamin Franklin. That was the title of part of our lesson today. You can fool all the people some of the time, and some of the people all the time, but you cannot fool all the people all the time. That's a modern day proverb that gives the idea of ultimately your dishonesty and your lying, or our dishonesty and our lying, is going to be found out by someone. Generally, if we look at the case of someone that is practicing deceit in business, there's what people refer to as whistleblowers. Eventually, somebody gets fed up with the activity and lets somebody else know, the authorities or some other person, in a way that it ends up coming back and being visited upon them. In the case of any of us that are practicing or living in our lives a behavior that is contrary to God's will, it will ultimately be found out in some way. Unless we're living in a remote environment and we're the only person there where only God sees our activities, somebody will see our behavior at some point, and it will be known. You can't hide it. Well, that's true. You might hide it from man, but God will see it. But I think in many cases that ultimately men, if we associate it with mankind, will see our dishonesty or the false impressions that we're leaving that show that. Next one I wanted to look at was honesty pays, but it does not seem to pay enough to suit a lot of people. Now that drives a lot of thinking, and this is attributed to unusual quotations here by Ken Hubbard. It's a common thought process, though. You know, honesty doesn't pay enough to be for some people, so they end up deciding to be deceitful. And it drives their motivation, and often that goes back to greed or to status or some other thing that is prideful that pushes an individual to behave in a way that's inconsistent. Honesty is the fastest way to prevent a mistake from turning into a failure. This relates to the idea of, as I talked about in business or in some other activity, about whistleblowers. If early enough on, a major mistake could be averted if people listen to the whistleblower. That's the fastest way to present a mistake is keep from turning it into a failure. Let's say I make a design mistake. In engineering, there's a rule called 110-100. If I catch it early in the design phase, it only costs me $1 to fix it. If I wait till I get to the prototype stage, it's going to cost me $10 to fix it. If I wait till I get to the production phase, it's going to cost me $100 to fix it. The longer you wait and delay on correcting something, the more serious it gets. And this fits with that same idea here. The quickest way to, or the fastest way to prevent a mistake is to keep from turning it into failure is to be honest about it. That's hard to do. As a young person in their career, the natural tendency is, from a maturity standpoint, is to, if I make a mistake, if it's not hurting anything, I'm just not going to say anything about it. Or go off and fix it on my own. Now, that's not a bad thing. If you can fix the mistake and you can correct it before anybody else finds out about it or before it affects anything else, well, that's part of your job, is fixing your mistakes. But if it's gotten out there and there's a potential for harm or damage, it's incumbent upon an individual to be honest about it as soon as possible. Honesty and transparency make you vulnerable. Be honest and transparent anyway. That's interesting. This is a quote from Mother Teresa. And it could be attributed to any number of people, but it conveys a very different idea. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to bring this one out. Honesty and transparency do make us vulnerable. If we're honest about how we feel about something, or let's say I am an individual that suffers from, let's say I suffer from depression, and I talk openly and honestly about that, it could hurt my opportunities to find a job. It leaves me vulnerable if someone else views me as potentially being in a situation that would not allow me to achieve the goals that the company wanted. Now, technically, they shouldn't be discriminating on those grounds, but once something's out there, it's really hard to take it out. Being honest as a Christian about our opinions on, shall we say, the creation in a school environment can subject us to significant ridicule by the professors that are teaching the class. Being honest leaves us vulnerable to that. But what's the last part of this quote say? Do it anyway. Why do we do it anyway? It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And I think it's important to tie together with this an attribute of God that is a steadfast attribute of God as it relates to honesty. What is one attribute of God that is immutable? God cannot lie. And if we're applying that same type of comparison to ourselves from an honesty standpoint, it drives us, if we're trying to be Christ-like or God-like, for us to be immutable with respect to honesty. We cannot lie. We are not to lie. We are not to leave a false impression or a false perception. Thoughts and comments on this morning's lesson on honesty? Brent?
So the Lord looks on the heart. But then in Psalm 15, verses 1 and 2, one of the characteristics of one who would dwell in God's holy hill is he speaks the truth in his heart. So we want to let it be part of our core, not just...
You want it to be part of your core. So for those that couldn't hear that, Brent made the point that when God was speaking to Samuel about the choice of the king, is that God looks at the heart, not at the outward appearance. And it was the core of the inside of the heart that was important. Crass.
Before you were born, number 2 up there, it was quoted by in a Western TV program called Maverick. That's the first time I ever heard it, was probably in the 1960 time frame. You might have been born by then, but you were about that big. So I don't know where he got it, but that was a famous quote that he would say on the program that he was the star.
A lot of these quotes end up coming in at different times, and we don't necessarily... That one was one that I couldn't find who it was actually originally attributed to, but it is so true. Okay, put Maverick on it. Brother Burns.
They don't know what he actually said was, tell the truth, and you don't have to remember anything. Others have said, always tell the truth because it's too difficult to remember all the lies. And that goes back to honesty. You always remember what is honest and right. You don't have to worry about the story changing.
That's very true. For those that couldn't hear that, you know, the point is making, if you tell the truth all the time, you don't have to worry about, you know, the lies that you're trying to hide and cover up. And one was attributed to Mark Twain and then some others, but that's very true. If you start a train of dishonesty in one activity and you're challenged on it, if you're going to maintain that storyline, what do you then have to do? Tell another lie. And if somebody, you know, and we watch television programs where the legal system's interrogating somebody and they pick apart the lies and, oh, well, we now have you on video showing this. Well, that's what we don't want to be doing, is we just want to tell the truth. What does the Bible say? The truth shall, and in this case it's talking about the truth of the gospel, the truth shall set you free. And in the case of an individual that's being honest with respect to their lies, I think you can make a parallel statement. The truth will set you free. Any other comments? Doug?
Honesty and transparency.
Transparency makes you vulnerable. Who was that?
Oh,
Jesus Christ. That is that way. He did it anyway. And there were so many ways he could have been dishonest. More than any of those, I think. Just by saying who he was, by having power, being able to do things that we can't do. But he chose to do what was right. Even though it went bad.
true. Jesus did exemplify being honesty in the face of great adversity. One thing I want to add to this honesty and transparency as it relates to biblical principles. When we are told to confess our faults one to another, this is the type of passage that applies to that. You know, that confessing our faults to one another leaves us vulnerable. You know, someone can take advantage of it. The scripture there doesn't say only confess your faults to one another if you think you're going to be able to come out of it okay. It says do it. And assume that the people that are surrounding you will behave correctly themselves. Albert?
And on one of those slides, Proverbs 23, I believe, it says, buy the truth and sell it.
Buy the truth and sell it not. Absolutely. Thank you for your comments this morning.